Hello and welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Learning, Litigating, and Liberating, Defending Against the AI Surveillance of Youth. The Gault Center is so pleased to host this session in partnership with the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative as part of our ongoing racial justice training series, especially at a time when young people's freedom to be, to grow, and to thrive is threatened at every turn. We hope that you'll share in the chat today. The chat is open and available to participants, where you're coming from, what office you're in, and your interest in AI surveillance. Today, our goals for this session are for us as a community to lean into the power of questions. We're asking each one of us who are here participating today to ask in our local communities, what's happening with AI surveillance? We want to be provoking critical thinking and driving action that unravels this ever-tightening web of surveillance that is surrounding and entrapping so many young people in our lives and who we work with. We are all schooled in the power of questions. It's how we were taught to investigate the law and the facts. But AI surveillance demands that we question what we cannot see and requires us to make the invisible visible to all so that we can develop the strategies to defend against these increasingly invasive technologies. And as defenders and advocates for young people, the law and policy around AI surveillance is being determined today. And our work with the young people that we serve will, in fact, shape the future of what freedom and liberty means for young people and generations to come. So today, we're so happy to be with all of you to dig into this and to learn together. We want you to know that the Zoom feature has accessibility options. Please ask questions in the chat if you're having trouble engaging with them. We want to invite you to share reactions in the chat as well. And we would invite you to share information you have about AI surveillance locally. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. We are so grateful to them for their groundbreaking work that will help us all understand and unravel the growing levels of AI surveillance young people face each day. Our first speaker will be Clarence Okoh. Clarence is a civil and human rights attorney working at the intersection of race, technology, and the law. And he currently serves as the National Director of Civil Rights and Technology at Techtonic Justice, a national nonprofit organization that leverages law and organizing to defend the rights of poor and working class people against AI and automation. He's also the co-founder of the Notice Coalition, No Tech Criminalization in Education, a national advocacy network that he's going to talk to us more about today. Our second speaker will be Shreya Tewari, who serves as resource counsel for the Fourth Amendment Center at the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers, which provides the defense bar with resources and litigation support designed to preserve privacy rights in the digital age. And finally, our very own Eduardo Ferrer, who serves as the associate professor at Georgetown University Law Center and is the supervising attorney of students in the Juvenile Justice Clinic and as the policy director of the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Initiative. And Eduardo will serve as our responder, helping us to engage and ask those questions to help us all unravel what's happening with AI surveillance in our community. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us today, and we're excited to get started. Clarence?
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks to everybody for having me with you all today. Super excited to get into this topic, which, there's just so few headlines about, so little news about. But no, excited to wade through all of the complexities and nuances, but also the opportunities that we are seeing as we are transitioning into this digital world. So let me share my slides real quick. And let me go here. All right, so I'm going to kick us off by just doing some grounding around the scope and prevalence of AI surveillance technologies in the lives of young folks, the young folks that we serve. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just kind of helping introduce us to some of the language and key concepts that can help us navigate this topic. I'll then talk a little bit about some of the kind of critical race and digital justice framings that should help us navigate and understand how these issues are playing out in young folks' lives. I'll spend a little bit of time on a few case studies to really do a deep dive on these issues. And then, of course, try to end on a bright spot of how young people and communities are actively fighting back against the dystopias that we find ourselves in. As Marianne said, my name is Clarence. I'm the National Director of Civil Rights Technology at Techtonic. We are a relatively new organization, but a lot of our work focuses on supporting communities, particularly low-income and working-class communities that are navigating the realities of AI injustice, particularly in public benefits programs, but other public goods and services as well. And then talk a lot more about the Notice Coalition, but we are a national advocacy network fighting to end youth surveillance and AI injustice in schools. So let's get into some of our key concepts. So I'm sure, it's so funny because I've been doing some of these presentations now for a number of years. And when I would ask folks, like, what is artificial intelligence back in the day, in like 2021, folks would sometimes look at me puzzled and be like, I actually don't really know what that means. A lot has changed since then. But I do want to I want to offer a little bit more complexity to the definitions so that we can all be on the same page as we're navigating the conversation. So oftentimes when I ask folks what AI is, we immediately think of chatbots. We think of things like Claude, or we think of ChatGPT or Grok or whatever chatbot that is annoying you in your life today. But I want us to really think more expansively about what artificial intelligence actually is. This is the definition that we have from the OECD. They're this multilateral body that has developed one of the older definitions of artificial intelligence that you'll see show up in a variety of government-based definitions today. So essentially, this definition is that for a set of inputs, artificial intelligence is a machine-based system that will generate a variety of outputs that can take the form of predictions, content recommendations, so on and so forth. This is a very technocratic definition of artificial intelligence. And I think while it's useful in order to kind of get a sense of what this is, I think we need a little more context. So I like to talk about what is AI in justice, because I think that concept really helps us in the field understand what we're up against, what our clients are up against, as these technologies are intruding upon their rights and freedoms. So I define AI injustice as the role of emerging technologies in reproducing social inequality through the systematic violations of fundamental rights and the denial of basic human needs, such as education, healthcare, housing, and public services. So that when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're not just talking about chatbots, we're talking about a variety of machine-based interventions that have the capabilities of doing a variety of things, whether it's computer vision technologies that are embedded in facial recognition, whether it's predictive analytics that we see in predictive policing programs, whether we're talking about a variety of other interventions. AI is a very broad and capacious term. And we should think about that as we're thinking about these technologies, because oftentimes we see the chatbots are put out in front of us. We kind of fixate on those, but there are all these other AI systems that are operating in the background, especially as it relates to the educational context, especially as it relates to these topics of youth surveillance. It's those other forms of AI that are the ones that create a lot of harm, in addition to some of the things that the chatbots do as well. Let me go back. So I want to introduce you all to this concept of the digital push-out crisis. So where to begin? Obviously, everyone in this space is here because we care about the impact of criminalizing systems on young folks. And I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of the concept of the school to prison pipeline, the school prison nexus. But essentially, I use the term digital push out to talk about the way in which the school to prison pipeline is being transformed in the era of artificial intelligence. And there are a number of ways in which this is playing out, which we'll get to in a second. But digital push out is not something that is a far off challenge or something that we're worrying about in the future. It is actively taking place today. And while I'm going to focus a lot in today's conversation around the uses of AI for exclusionary discipline, youth surveillance, and other kind of like data-driven policing harms that are happening in schools, I also want to note that that's only one way in which young people are being disconnected and denied the right to a public education. There are a variety of other ways in which schools are using artificial intelligence, from developing IEPs and 504 plans to replacing human translators for students who are English language learners. So that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but I just want to make sure that folks are familiar with that this issue is very, very expansive. But obviously, a lot of the concerns that we have around surveillance technologies and other forms of policing using big data are warranted, as we'll get to later in the conversation. So let's talk about what makes AI and this kind of digital push-out crisis different from some of the more historical practices that we've seen in schools. I'm not going to go through this exhaustively, but I will touch on them lightly, and we'll return to these throughout the rest of the presentation. So a couple of observations from my work that I've seen in terms of how AI is different than existing methods of criminalization. One is that artificial intelligence removes the kind of human limitations for criminalizing young people. This is a very disturbing thought when I was developing this, but one of the things that I have really encountered throughout my work in this space has been that there is, in a very kind of crude way, a limitation in terms of what how human-based systems for criminalizing young people, like how much criminalization they can do, right? You have to have, for example, if you're talking about the educational context, like there's only so many searches that an SRO can do in a particular day. Still has absolutely devastating impacts and consequences. But what artificial intelligence does is it takes that infrastructure and it expands it to really limitless potentials, that you can be running searches using an artificial intelligence system, whether it's embedded in a camera system that a school district is using, whether it's on a child's device, that you can kind of constantly be searching these young people, their records, and other protected information over the course of the day in ways that just would not be possible for humans. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Artificial intelligence also expands the terrain of youth criminalization. In other words, where young people can be criminalized. So we know about the kind of classic spaces where young people experience criminalization. So whether that is in schools, whether that's at home, whether that's in neighborhood settings. But obviously, as everybody on this call knows, that there are these kind of digital ecosystems where young people are also being subject to surveillance. And that when we think about these data-driven technologies and the capabilities that they offer schools, law enforcement, other entities, there are a whole new possibility of ways in which young people can experience criminalization. AI enables perpetual surveillance. So not only are we expanding the places where surveillance can happen and criminalization can happen, but we're also expanding the time frame under which these things can take place. So we'll get a little bit more into predictive policing, for example, where we can leverage existing data about young people to make predictions around future criminality. And so in that way, we are policing young people before they even commit a crime. And this kind of big data aggregation and collection that is required to sustain these AI systems, that they also allow for retrospective criminalization. So something that you did, months, weeks, years ago, we now have the data to be able to go back and retroactively criminalize a person for what they've done in the past. So again, we're not only expanding the places where criminalization can happen, but we're also expanding that timeline as well. AI also allows for youth criminalization to be distributed across systems, so that it's not just law enforcement that is able to do this. We obviously know about the history of schools criminalizing young people, and that is true. But basically, any system that is gathering data, collecting data about young people can become a site of criminalization, because that data can be used in a variety of ways to criminalize young folks. And then we also have digital confinement. So not only are these systems expanding the terrain of criminalization, but they enable a kind of new form of confinement. We'll talk more about this when we get into app-based community supervision. But think about youth surveillance and mass surveillance more broadly as kind of inverting the logic of mass incarceration. So under mass incarceration, the idea is that we're going to lock up the neighborhood. We're going to bring the neighborhood to prison. But under mass surveillance, under youth surveillance, we switch that on its head, that we're bringing those conditions of confinement to the community. And we'll get into what that looks like through these app-based services in a second. Going back up one, Obviously, artificial intelligence expands the profit incentives. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry, a $4 billion industry that's just dedicated to school surveillance technologies. And so obviously, there's always been a kind of a commercialization and other kind of financial incentives around criminalizing young people. But now we have entire companies that are selling these products, and their existence, their profitability is tied to being able to market and sell these technologies to schools. And then this last point I'm going to spend a little bit more time with is that when you take all of these experiences together, AI is really creating a new digital underclass. Because these young people, the same ones that are experiencing digital pushout in their schools and in their communities, these are the same young people who are either themselves, their families, or their communities are confronting a variety of other uses of artificial intelligence to deny basic human needs, to discriminate, to criminalize, to otherwise harm. So these are the same communities that are facing artificial intelligence when they're applying for jobs, hiring platforms, integrating AI, and denying people, particularly folks of color, opportunities for jobs or upper economic mobility. These are the same communities that are having to bear the consequences of the construction of data centers to be able to sustain these technologies. These are the same communities that are dealing with tenant screening algorithms that are denying Black and Brown communities access to housing opportunities. So that it's not, we shouldn't just understand these technologies as in isolation of one another, but that they collectively burden particular communities, and that this is kind of creating in many ways, a new iteration, a new generation of structural racism within our society. So let's get into some of the numbers, because again, I know when I first learned about these topics, I was like, oh, this stuff is happening, like, yeah, but maybe not frequently, right? Like this is not, we're not living in a full dystopia. And then of course, we look at the numbers, that is not the case. We are there. So the top line here is that, you have about 90% of educators saying that their schools are using some form, at least one form of AI surveillance technology, the most popular of which are student device monitors. If you're familiar with companies like GoGuardian and Gaggle and many others, these are software programs that are essentially installed onto school-issued devices, so predominantly laptops, but even school iPads as well. And they essentially monitor everything that a child does on that device. Every time they log on, they can see all the text messages. If you're texting via your device, they can see all of the written assignments that you were writing. They can see all of your coursework. Like they have access to everything. And it's not just during the school day. Many of these systems track young people into after school time as well. And the way that this program works is that if a student basically engages or says something that the school district or that the company deems as, problematic or harmful or indicating that they're going to harm themselves or others, that it'll generate an alert. And that alert will normally during school hours go to school officials, but in after school hours, those alerts will go directly to law enforcement in many communities around the country. There's about, forget the number, but it's somewhere around about 40% of teachers said that they knew of a student who was contacted by law enforcement as a consequence of student device monitoring. Facial recognition, folks, I'm sure are familiar with. Facial recognition is being used in a variety of ways in schools. One of the more popular ways is to regulate access into the school building. So sometimes you will see school districts like create lists of people who are prohibited from accessing schools, including students that are like suspended or who have been expelled. And again, this creates another site for criminalization. AI threat detectors, we'll talk a little bit more about in detail in a second, but threat detection technologies are a AI rebranding of like metal detectors. But a lot of these, there's kind of two genres of them. There's one that is like a AI metal detector, just looks like a traditional metal detector, but it uses the science of AI to like more accurately identify weapons. And then there's like the more problematic version of it, which is AI threat detection that's integrated within cameras, in the case of school cameras. And the idea is that they can use the magic of AI to be able to identify weapons, even concealed weapons. Preview is it can't do that. It can't do that stuff. It's woefully inaccurate, and can wreak havoc in the lives of young people. We have AI hall monitors, yes, because why not? So AI hall monitors are technology that allows for schools to track students as they're moving throughout the school to go use the restroom. So as opposed to like raising your hand and asking, "Can I use the bathroom?" Instead, they have to log on to their device. They submit a request to their teacher. The teacher approves the request, and many of these models have a geolocation feature on them, so that as your student has their phone on them and they're walking through the schools, it can see where that student is walking and if they are moving outside of like the designated path that they were supposed to be on, or they're outside the designated location that they requested to go to, that student can be essentially punished, that they'll send SROs or whoever. It's really interesting if you want to see how these technologies play out in schools. Like TikTok is actually a really good platform to learn about it, and you'll see a lot of videos of kids like trying to run back in time so that they don't miss the amount of time that was allotted for them by their AI hall pass. So they're trying to avoid the SRO because they went to the second floor bathroom as opposed to the first floor bathroom, and now the SRO is looking for them. So beyond hall monitors, we have AI emotion detection. Yes, emotion detection. This is a pseudoscientific technology, but that doesn't stop schools from purchasing it. You'll hear about schools that use this for like preventing bullying or other forms of harassment. The way that it allegedly works is that it can use a variety of sensors. So it's looking at, it has microphones, it has other sensors installed. Sometimes these are like combined with other software programs or other AI systems that the school will have in place. But essentially, the school will use artificial intelligence, this AI emotion recognition, to identify when students are engaging in language or if their emotions are indicating some kind of aggressive behavior. You'll also hear this referred to as aggression detection. It doesn't work. You can already see the ways in which this would have disparate consequences for Black and Brown students, other students who may, I'm very loud. So, like, if I'm walking through school and I'm saying things, I might be miscoded as engaging in aggressive behavior, and vice versa, right? We can imagine there are times in which the system is not going to identify students who are making threats, because not all forms of threats or aggression presents itself in the ways that can be coded by these machines. There's also vape detection, which we'll get to more in a second, but essentially a suite of biometric surveillance technologies that are supposed to be identifying vaping, but they have more capabilities beyond that. And you can see here that in anywhere between a quarter to a third of schools are using these technologies. And this is just based off of the survey from the Center on Democracy and Technology. Every year, these numbers, unfortunately, are going up. So remember I said earlier about how artificial intelligence can really take the top off of the capacity of state actors to surveil and to criminalize. This is a really powerful example. So earlier this year, the Notice Coalition, we obtained some open records about the use of flock cameras in schools. And what we have found is that, number one, there are school districts that are using cameras that Flock has access to. And in one school district in Texas, there were over 733,000 searches by over 3,100 different law enforcement agencies on this school's cameras. Several hundred of them were related to immigration searches by federal law enforcement agencies. There's no way to fully convey how horrific that is. There's no justification whatsoever for conducting 733,000 searches in a single school district, let alone by 3,100 law enforcement agencies. But that is where, unfortunately, we are. That is the current state of play. And it just gives you a really good sense of the kind of scale of criminalization that can happen with these technologies when they're introduced in schools. As I mentioned before, the school surveillance industry is about $4 billion. I mentioned about predictive policing. We have about 20% of educators saying that their schools are using artificial intelligence and other kind of algorithms to engage in predictive policing to identify future criminals. And then 17% of educators are saying that their school district is sharing data with ICE. Again, this is despite federal laws like FERPA, obviously Fourth Amendment protections and others that shield that data from redisclosure. And so, what's causing this, right? Because I know that's a lot to hear, and so I'm sure everyone is wondering, how do we get here? And there are a few drivers of the digital pushout crisis. I'm going to just briefly touch on a couple of them. Um, so the first is COVID era funding. COVID really was a game changer for the introduction of these surveillance technologies in schools. Obviously, as we're switching to remote learning, we're now looking for all of these new technologies to help kind of make that transition to remote learning happen, as well as transition back. But another key aspect of the COVID era was that schools receive unprecedented funding from the federal government. And the idea of the funding was to invest in public health resources in schools to be able to mitigate the impact of um, the public health crisis that was COVID-19. Unfortunately, schools said, "Oh, we got this money. Why don't we go spend millions of dollars on surveillance technologies?" And so during this time, and even to this day, you'll see school surveillance technology firms. You'll see them like actually intentionally market their products to schools and say, "Hey, there's this federal funding stream that's available." Obviously, the ESSER dollars are gone, but you are now starting to see, which is another point on here, states and other localities creating additional funding streams that are specifically dedicated to these technologies. And so oftentimes you'll see a very perverse marketing strategy from these companies to try and get schools to buy their technologies. Obviously, school shooting tragedies are another unfortunate point of entry for these technologies. Schools see surveillance technologies as kind of a panacea, and obviously that's not the case. But unfortunately, even during the Biden administration, we saw really unprecedented levels of federal investment into schools being able to purchase a variety of these technologies, especially school districts that were interested in setting up behavioral threat assessment teams. The BSCA, I think, creates like over $100 million on an annual basis for schools to be able to do threat assessments and other forms of surveillance. Um, Obviously, as we've talked about at the top, we still have a lack of comprehensive AI and data privacy regulations in this country. Federal government does not have them. States are increasingly beginning to adopt comprehensive consumer data privacy laws. Many of them exempt government as a whole. Many of them exempt schools, and many of them exempt young people. So that even when we are seeing protections emerge, those protections are not investing in the wellness of our young people and the safety of our young people. Um, and then one other thing I just want to highlight before moving on is this idea around techno solutionism and public narratives. One of the main drivers of these technologies is obviously we are seeing big tech really market AI to everybody. I mean, if you hop on your phone, you're going to get prompted to use artificial intelligence 12 times. If you try to search something on Google, you're going to get the results from Gemini before you can actually see the search results. But schools are also being directly targeted. I mean, I was literally just reading before this call a report where Anthropic, which is the maker of Claude, is like actively trying to push their products into schools. But that's not just, again, the chatbot folks that are doing this. A lot of these surveillance technology companies are also looking to try and market their products directly to schools. And we're living in this time, unfortunately, where schools don't see any other solution. They think that this, one, they believe what the companies say, and then two, because of pressures around staffing, lack of resources, so on and so forth, they see technology as a solution to their social problems. And that's what techno solutionism is. Just an idea that artificial intelligence and other forms of technology can solve intransigent social problems. And obviously, it's a misguided ideology, but it is really like the dominant paradigm governing schools right now. But these issues are not new. We've already seen multiple waves of harmful technologies show up in classrooms, oftentimes under the auspices of improving outcomes, but without ever delivering results. And there's a fantastic book that you see here called Access is Capture by Roger Cooks, How EdTech Reproduces Racial Inequality. And I highly encourage folks to seek out that resource if you want to see earlier versions of EdTech and the impact that it had on young folks. So that's actually a really good transition for us to zoom out and really kind of talk more about how these issues around surveillance and digital pushout are really reflective of a larger transformation in our society where we are seeing emerging technologies like artificial intelligence provide a foundation for the futures of structural racism and other forms of inequality within our society. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes just kind of introducing folks to race and digital justice. This is a perspective that is unfortunately not as accessible for folks. Oftentimes, I talk about these topics to a variety of audiences. I'll ask about, what are some of the harms and the concerns, the consequences of these systems, and you'll hear things about the data centers and the environmental impacts. You'll hear concerns about data privacy. You'll hear concerns around companies that are extracting our data and using it against us. But oftentimes, folks have a underdeveloped understanding, an undeveloped racial analysis of how these systems are reproducing racial inequality within society. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just kind of grounding us in that, and then we'll move forward and get a little bit more in those case studies. So I love this quote. It's by Ruth Benjamin, who we'll talk about more in a second. But she writes, if race is a kind of technology, one that, as I suggest, creates parallel social universes and premature death, then it requires routine maintenance and upgrade. Find it such a powerful quote because when I was introduced to concepts around race, racial injustice, I was always it was always framed to me as racism is something that is tied to this, tied to the vestiges of the past, right? Like it is something that happened and we are dealing with its consequences. But this idea of racism as dynamic, as innovative, as like a living thing that is constantly reimagining itself, that was something that it was a newer way to think about racism. And I think that's really important grounding for understanding these particular issues around digital push out, use, surveillance, that in many ways, these systems are a reimagining of these existing forms of racial injustice that we've seen impact our young people. So to get into a little bit more, Ruha Benjamin kind of outlines this concept of the new Jim Code. She describes the new Jim Code as the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but are oftentimes promoted as being more objective or progressive than the discrimination of the past. And I find this, again, highly recommend Ruha Benjamin's work. She's really one of the godmothers of this field around race and digital justice, MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner. And just absolutely like a literal genius. But I find this work so important and so grounding for how I think about these issues, because again, oftentimes you're going to be presented with these technologies as though they are the solution, as though they are race neutral, as though they are progressive, like machines can be biased. You'll hear all those talking points. And it's super important to be able to zoom out and understand how these systems are reproducing racial inequality, that they're not neutral, that they're not progressive, but that instead they are really tethering us to and pulling us back into paths of injustice. Another key concept I want to introduce is this idea of racializing surveillance. This is by a concept developed by a scholar named Simone Brown, another remarkable, incredible scholar. She's out of UT Austin, and someone who really is, again, another one of these kind of founding mothers of this space. And she describes racializing surveillance here. I'm going to give you all the cliff notes, which is that rather than just thinking about surveillance as something some powerful entity watching you or looking over you. That's a part of it, but that's an insufficient definition. For her, racializing surveillance is how surveillance practices can produce racial difference. That she uses example of a slave ship, and she talks about how the slave ship kind of embodies the dynamic of how surveillance can produce race. That you had in the slave ship, Black folks, enslaved Africans in the steerage, who could not look up, right? Because you have the floorboards and all that that block you. So you can't look up, but you know that you are being placed beneath the folks who have enslaved you. And then above, you have the slave catchers who were able to look down, look below, and manage and regulate what was happening in the steerage, but that the folks below, again, couldn't look up and see them. And if you understand the word surveillance, surveillance actually comes from a French term, two French terms, sur, which means on or above, and then veille, which means to watch or to see. And so surveillance literally at its core means to watch from above, which means it's not just about someone watching you, but it's about watching you in a way that creates a power dynamic, that creates a political dynamic. And in the context of the United States, that political dynamic largely revolves around this idea of racial difference. And that's really a lot of what her work does. I'm saying that to say that often when we talk about artificial intelligence, we start getting really caught up in the ones and the zeros. We want to understand the code. We want to do all of these complex analyses, but we don't look at the kind of the way in which these technologies are arranging and shifting power. And for me, if you really want to understand not only how these systems are operating, but how we can fight back against them, you have to understand how power is being distributed through these machines. So let's get into the case studies. So I'm going to kick us off first by coming back to this conversation on AI weapons detection systems. So as I mentioned before, variety of AI detection systems. Some of them look like traditional metal detectors, and they'll have like an AI component that helps to analyze the results. But the one that we see often showing up in schools are AI weapons detectors that are integrated within school camera systems. And the way it works, it uses computer vision to be able to identify objects that are related to weapons or threats, which is something that's a kind of newer version of this. So there's both the weapons detection, we're trying to identify, guns, knives, things of that nature. But now we're also seeing this genre of threat detectors, and threat can be defined as broadly as the school district or the company defines it. Coming back to this, we see this in hundreds of schools, if not thousands of schools around the country. We know that this technology is deeply problematic from a technical aspect. I would argue, and so would the FTC, that it's a fraudulent technology, that oftentimes they'll sell it to schools as being this kind of accurate system that will be able to prevent the next school shooting tragedy. But in reality, when it's been tested, what we have found is that the technology can have a false alarm rate exceeding 50%. That means that these technologies are about as accurate as a coin toss. And the consequences of this can be incredibly dangerous and harmful for young people. Late last year, Notice Coalition, we ended up writing an op-ed in the Baltimore Beat because the Baltimore County School District, had purchased an AI detector, AI weapons detection system, to use in its school district. And one evening, there was a group of Black students who were sitting out after football practice, waiting for their parents to pick them up. And all of a sudden, there was a series of police squad cars that pull up. And the officers are approaching these young Black men, their guns drawn, they're throwing the young men onto the ground, they're arresting them, they're detaining them. And the school district, the police officers are conducting these searches and they're looking for something, and the young people are confused. And we get the body worn camera footage and we hear that the officers are also confused because they are looking for a gun, right? They got a call that there was some kids and outside the school and that one of them had a gun, but they're not seeing the gun on any other kids. They're looking around the grounds, not seeing it. And then finally, they ask, well, who called us out? Who made this call? And they said, oh, it was the AI. And they look at the image that the AI said was the kid having a gun. And what they saw was that the kid was eating a bag of Dorito chips, and that the AI system had mistaken the bag of Doritos for a handgun. And as a consequence, these kids were arrested. They were placed on the ground. They were searched by law enforcement. And all of us who do this work, we understand that that story could have ended in a very different way. But the school district felt that this was the technology solution and continued to use it. In the opposite direction, there was a horrible story out of Nashville, Tennessee, where a school district was trying to prevent a school shooting, and so they purchased these AI weapons detection system, installed it on their cameras, and then one day a kid unfortunately brought a gun to school and shot several students at the school, and one of them died. And despite them having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on these detectors, the detector didn't go off. And the company came up with all kinds of excuses about why the AI didn't work. But even in the instance where it was there to protect young people, it failed to do so, and young people lost their lives as a consequence. So this just kind of shows both of these examples, herring examples, show like this is not just an esoteric conversation. Like this is a life or death decision that schools are making when they're purchasing and using these technologies. So quickly on community supervision, obviously I think folks are increasingly aware of this, that we are seeing a shift where many courts are trying to experiment with moving from ankle monitoring, electronic monitoring, to these kind of app-based services. Many of them have a variety of surveillance features to them that folks aren't aware of. So obviously there's geolocation tracking, there's facial recognition where the student or the child has to check in to check in using the app and using the facial recognition system to verify that it's them. And there are a variety of other really harmful surveillance features integrated into this. Going back to that concept of the new Jim Code, that oftentimes these technologies will present themselves as more progressive and more fair, or more, whatever. That's what's happening here. So oftentimes these companies will come to the courts and say, hey, this is a more humane and this is a better version of being able to conduct community supervision than some of these historical practices, including ankle monitoring. And it's a complicated conversation because in certain jurisdictions, like there just aren't a lot of choices, and this might be the least restrictive choice, at least at the surface level. But there are all these other harms embedded underneath these app-based services that folks are oftentimes not aware of. Many of these programs are developed by private companies that are doing all kinds of things with students' data that we don't know about, that can be commercialized or exploited or used in a variety of other ways. And at least with one of the more prominent vendors in this space, the same company that's providing community supervision apps to juvenile courts are the same ones that are providing that same community supervision service, service to ICE and CBP and other federal immigration law enforcement agencies. So that's why I think we have to be more rigorous in terms of the questions that we're asking and scrutinizing these products. Because just because the company says that this is least restrictive or that it's a better alternative than electronic monitoring, that means that we need to ask more questions to understand what exactly are we signing up for, and are there other choices or opportunities that we should be thinking about beyond continuing this really dark historical legacy that goes back to chattel slavery. As I mentioned before, this is just more about the work that we did around flock cameras in schools. And as I mentioned before, it is absolutely devastating to see the scale and scope of surveillance that these technologies allow. There's at least 100 school districts around the country that we were able to find that had flock cameras within schools. Obviously, that number is likely woefully incomplete, and there are probably many, many, many other schools around the country who either directly or their SROs are granting access to flock to access school cameras. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on vape detection because I want to speak about both the issue and then some of the strategies that are available to us to be able to fight back against these very harmful technologies. So folks may be familiar, may not be familiar with AI vape detection. Again, this is a product that is developed by a variety of private companies and sold to school districts. Schools can spend anything from like several $100,000 of purchasing these technologies. Some school districts, including those in suburban Atlanta, have spent I think it was over $10 million purchasing these AI vape detectors. So they can be a very expensive technology for schools that are cash strapped. But we learned about this through some reporters down in Alabama. What we had heard down there was that the school districts that were purchasing these AI vape detection technologies were also developing these specialized courts to be able to, essentially criminalize young people for vaping in schools. The way that it was told to us by some local organizers was that the school districts that were exploring these vape courts and the AI vape detectors, that they had such a large crisis of young people who were vaping that they had essentially run out of suspension days which I had never heard of as a concept before. But again, this idea of AI surveillance being able to expand the capacity to criminalize is playing out again in this context. So they ran out of suspension days. They need to come up with a new way of punishing young people. They create these vape courts, but they also want to be able to catch young people more effectively. So they decided to contract with these vape companies, these AI vape detector companies. The way that it works, these sensors are installed in sensitive locations in schools. So think about bathrooms, locker rooms, areas where you can't put a camera. And the way that they work is they have these air particulate matter sensors, basically like these really fancy sensors that are supposed to be able to detect using the magic of artificial intelligence when a student is vaping. As you can imagine, doesn't work that way. Number one, these technologies are just as inaccurate, if not more so, than those threat detectors that we talked about earlier. But number two, there are all these other surveillance capabilities that they don't tell schools about, but are still within their products. So AI vape detectors, for example, will have microphones in them, and that's a part of their like aggression detection capability that I mentioned before. This is oftentimes bundled together, the aggression detection and the vape detection. We also see in many of these vape detection products, they'll have thermal imaging, and the idea there is that if kids are falling down, they can see that there's like a heat sensor of like, oh, this person's laying prone. We should send somebody to go and assist them. And then there's also facial recognition integrations. And so what'll happen is, well, we can't put the camera in the bathroom. We'll put cameras right outside the bathroom so that if the sensor goes off, that all the students who walk out around that time, you can use facial recognition to automatically identify them, and you can send an alert to the principal's office or whoever is the person designated to receive the alerts, oftentimes SROs. They'll receive those alerts, and then they can go and investigate, suspend the kids, discipline them, arrest them, so on and so forth. So we at the Notice Coalition decided to investigate this because this is one of the clearest examples of the school to prison pipeline. We had partners in Minneapolis who were particularly interested in it. So we did a really deep dive in the state of Minnesota to try and give us a sense of like, what does this look like? How are schools using this technology? How is it impacting young people? And, really kind of put a fine point on it. This is like one of the clearest examples of how AI is really becoming this like initiating point for the school to prison pipeline. Technologies that are being installed in school bathrooms is detecting the young people, is sending that data as an alert to law enforcement that can then refer these kids out to these specialized vape courts. It's a very clear example, and it also kind of shows again the way in which AI surveillance really opens up the capacity to criminalize young people. That it would be very creepy to have an adult in the bathroom, like with some kind of sensor watching to see whether or not kids are vaping. But we are comfortable using these technologies as a society. We are comfortable using those technologies to do essentially the same thing. And you can see there's a dollar sign here because, again, these technologies are very expensive, and there are companies that are making money off of these practices. So how do we go about like investigating and challenging some of these systems? So with this particular case, what we did was, as you saw before, we did a report in 2024 using a combination of open records and available public data to just get a sense of how many school districts in the state of Minnesota were using that technology and how is it impacting rates of school discipline. We saw that in the years that AI vape detection adoption increased in Minnesota, we also saw an increase in the number of kids who were being punished for smoking tobacco-related incidents in schools, that it became, I think, either the third or fourth leading cause of student discipline in the state had jumped up in a very significant way. And so we wanted to investigate even further to understand like how this technology worked, what was it capable of, what its impacts were, so on and so forth. So we built a multidisciplinary team. We brought in technologists. We brought in folks that had done experience doing AI audits. We had a couple of community organizers, a lawyer, which was me, a couple of youth advocates, and then we also had an artist and cultural organizer. This interdisciplinary team is important because we wanted to ask a variety of different questions, and we needed different disciplines that could answer those different questions. What are the legal implications? How are young people experiencing this? What does this technology do? What claims are the companies making, and are those claims true? We needed that team so we could answer those questions. And then we, like I said, leveraged those multidisciplinary research methods, everything from open records requests, scientific literature reviews. We had people doing social media content analysis. We had people doing focus groups and interviews. And we also had a cultural organizer who was developing art to help communicate what they were seeing to community stakeholders to understand the threats and impacts. And we put all that together in a couple of research products, including this article that you see here that was published in Tech Policy Press. We found that in a series of schools that had done a vape detection pilot program, only 4 schools in this particular case, we saw that over the course of the year, that the vape detectors had produced over 20,000 alerts, even though only 88 students were punished for vaping. So again, that scale versus it's ridiculous, right? 20,000. And what we found from that 20,000 was there were alerts that were happening at all hours of the day and night. Alerts going off at 2:30 in the morning, alerts going off during winter break, summer break. Kids, nobody's in the building, and the machine is still generating alerts. So again, these are experimental technologies, and the impact is very, very harmful. Again, as you can see, in one school, we had 600 alerts in a single day. And then we also saw student discipline increase over 121% across the schools that had used this vape detection pilot. We also saw, very alarmingly, how schools began to respond to the student discipline concerns, like over disciplining. And they came up with this new discipline intervention of these early dismissals. They would just send kids home. They wouldn't punish them formally because that would be recorded by the state. And some of these schools were still under civil rights investigations for essentially the state had been opening up investigations for years for these schools engaging in racialized exclusionary discipline. And so to avoid a liability and accountability to the state, they had developed these early dismissals so that they would make their numbers for discipline look lower than what they actually were. So that 121% increase is actually a undercount of the number of kids that were being disciplined as a consequence of these faulty and fraudulent vape detection technologies. And so just really quickly, as I mentioned, we launched our investigation. We developed these different reports. And if you want to learn more about them, I highly encourage y'all to check out those resources, which are already available on the Gault Center's website. So to end on a quick happy note, because again, this stuff can be very depressing. Wherever we see innovations in injustice, we are seeing innovations in justice as well. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking both about the Notice Coalition and then some really cool youth-led resistance work that's happening around the country. So the Notice Coalition, our origin story is that we are from 2 different coalitions that were fighting a very similar predictive policing program. One in Ramsey County, which is up in Minnesota, and then another in Pasco County, Florida, both of which had developed very similar style predictive policing programs. We're going to take all this data about young people and we're going to use it to make predictions about future criminality. My co-founder of the Notice Coalition, Marika Pfefferkorn, who you see in the image on the left, she was far more effective than we were in Pasco, so they were able to stop their program from going into place due to local organizing and resistance work. But in Florida, we didn't learn about it until local reporters broke a story and then mobilized the community to be able to successfully end that program. And so the Notice Coalition really is about communities that have fought these issues firsthand, working together to create a national infrastructure. Because when we fought those fights, we fought alone. And that was both a barrier of frustration and it was an obstacle because there were so many things that we could have been able to do quicker if we had known about the work in Ramsey County, if we knew about other communities that were fighting against this. So that's what we created the Notice Coalition to do, to be this kind of national resource hub where we can support communities around the country. We can support frontline advocates, attorneys, organizers, artists, cultural organizers who are fighting against these systems. And we do this in a variety of ways. As you've seen, we do a bunch of research and legal investigations into how these technologies are playing out. We've done AI auditing before. We also do a lot of convening. We did a national youth summit on digital liberation, bringing together young people from around the country who are fighting against these systems to share ideas and to learn from one another. We've done speaker series, we've done an artist residency program, we've done a fellowship program for grassroots organizers and advocates, and then we have our digital platform, our newsletter, our website. We also have a blog and other digital resources that are available for folks. And we're always available to do public education trainings and workshops because I imagine this is a lot of information to process. And I know a lot of times folks have follow-up questions or also wanted to work on these issues more in their communities. And then just to spotlight this, right? So it's not just the work of notice at the national level, but there are amazing groups of young people around the country who are fighting against these systems in their own communities. I wanted to spotlight one, Puente, Arizona. So a youth-led organization that's been fighting over the last couple of years against e-hall passes that are being used in Phoenix area schools. And they have been doing some really creative work to both mobilize their base of young folks to show up at school board meetings, to show up engaging with education policymakers to fight back against the growing encroachment of e-hall passes and other surveillance technologies in those schools. And Puente is just one of many youth organizations around the country that are actively fighting back against these harms. And so, there are a lot of things that folks can do to engage in these fights. We can talk more about that later. But the big thing I would say is, continue to share the stories of what you're seeing in your communities, because the more that we know, to Marianne's point, the better that we can fight back. We can ask better questions and we can mobilize our field. And then the other thing I would say is, as I mentioned before, please stay connected with us and others who are doing incredible work in this space, because we are all learning this in real time. And the stronger we act as a field, I think the better we can serve our young people. Here's just a quick little link to our, this is already on the Gault Center website, and we can also follow up afterwards. But this is a link to our notice newsletter. And I just want to say thank you all for your time and attention. And I'm going to stop sharing and toss it over to Shreya.
And as Shreya comes on and joins us, and she'll share her slides, I just want to say thank you so much to Clarence for all of that incredible information. And thank you, Shreya.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you, Gault Center, for having me. And thank you, Clarence. Yeah, it's always really, really amazing to hear Clarence talk about this stuff, to hear about everything that Notice is doing, especially. All right, let me make sure that I put this up.
Shreya, we can see your notes. So switch.
Yeah, I was just thinking, okay, there we go. That must be the right way. Yep. I've done this many times and I almost always share the wrong version first, so it's fine. One time I had written in all caps, introduce yourself, which was great. So anyway, let me go ahead and do that. Hi, everyone. My name is Shreya, and I'm the Resource Counsel at the NACDL Fourth Amendment Center. I'm here to chat with you all about some of the work that we've been doing on youth surveillance and some of the policy recommendations that we've developed on the subject, as well as what we're hearing on the ground from other defenders that are seeing this tech and these practices and are finding ways to challenge it, just like you all. I know that Clarence has already given you all an incredible overview of the tech and kind of a background of the topic, so I'll be brief in giving you some background info, but I just wanted to start with a little bit of context in how we're approaching the work, and if you're not familiar with our organization. So the Fourth Amendment Center, we litigate and create resources on tech and surveillance issues for defenders. And in 2020, NACDL convened a predictive policing task force, which published a massive report and a set of recommendations in 2021 regarding various issues surrounding data-driven policing. That report acknowledged some of the differences in the recommendations and how some of the special considerations and how this tech was being applied to youth, how those policing practices were being applied, but didn't focus on it as much in depth. And we realized that it was a topic that really needed its own in-depth exploration and some resources dedicated to it, which is what we're doing now as we see this becoming so pervasive and tied to youth. Obviously, since that time, and especially since COVID, the surveillance of youth has increased significantly and become much more ubiquitous. A lot of it was, kind of with COVID and with the advent of remote learning, but there are other reasons too, of course, many of which Clarence mentioned, with the surveillance tech market just sort of booming and becoming more profitable in general, concerns around, weapons management and school safety, response to school shootings, and all of those factors. Our recommendations and the forthcoming report that they're going to accompany have been developed based on our understanding of the impacts of these growing youth surveillance regimes, and most importantly, and more specific to our mission and to all of your work, how they increase youth contact with law enforcement and the criminal legal system. We're also intending to use this report and opening these conversations with you all and youth justice units around the country to develop further resources for youth defense, focusing on how to challenge surveillance in cases for your clients. And here, just a few recent headlines, some of which similar to the ones Clarence shared as well. Flock accessing cameras in a school gym, Waymo getting teens arrested by alerting them for drinking, Bus Patrol, an AI company that's putting little surveillance systems in school buses that they want to connect to law enforcement offices, and then of course, anti-vape detectors, as Clarence just talked about. The consequences of integrating these tech systems into everything, as Clarence mentioned, are that they only exacerbate and further entrench the inequalities that already exist in school punishment and criminal enforcement. For example, Black children are already much more likely to be punished, even at younger ages. Kids with disabilities are usually punished disproportionately for the same conduct. And not to mention, students and families that are vulnerable to ICE enforcement, which these days is almost anyone of color, are all further made vulnerable by digitizing these systems. So where the data is fed, who has access to it, and the amount of data being generated about these students in order to punish them or categorize them criminally is this additional automated version of discrimination against kids that are already more vulnerable to being targeted by law enforcement. So let's talk about the school from hell. This is a map depicting the surveillance ecosystem that a young person faces or will soon be facing in the near future, depending on where they live. I want to first note that we developed this map with the spectacular University of Iowa Tech Law Clinic, directed by Professor Megan Graham and designed by our incredible law student collaborators, Tara, Jonah, and Morgan. We call this Hell School because it is a visualization of every possible technology that we're aware of that is being used in this way or could be used in this way. The average school probably won't have every single one at once, but there are jurisdictions where this is not too far off from reality. And we think big picture that this is very close to where things are headed as this tech becomes more affordable and more accessible. So a closer look at the key to this map. The map represents a number of categories of tools that Clarence went through with you all. Digital monitoring tools, including the digital hall passes, facial recognition, and AI hubs and visitor management systems, which can all essentially function as mini real-time crime centers and also feed into real-time crime centers. Environmental detector categories of tools, such as the vape detectors and sensors, the weapons detectors, the so-called bullying monitors and aggression detection tools, as well as the more traditional law enforcement active intervention tools and external surveillance, like automatic license plate readers, drones, stop sign cameras, and so on. If we zoom in a little bit further and look at a specific area of the school, looking over here, if we look specifically at this, restrooms and locker rooms, there is literally nowhere for kids to have privacy anymore, to the point that they anticipate being censored and monitored in places like this, where traditionally we all expected privacy. It's not just smoking and vaping. Again, it's the bullying monitors, the motion sensors. Motion sensors can activate the camera when you leave the space, so they know which kids were just in there. This inflects with the criminal legal system in so many ways. And ultimately, that camera, for example, could be connected to the SRO office or the visitor management AI system, which could be either directly connected to a local real-time crime center or simply get passed on to them via the school resource officers. And but essentially the whole system becomes effortless and totally seamless with the technology to do everything for them, not to mention the discriminatory aspects. For example, the threat detection alerts can be based on absolutely anything. We don't know how any of the algorithms are trained. They're made by a number of private companies. We've heard from many of these companies that this can include things like the volume of speaking, which Clarence mentioned earlier. These are not in any way individualized, so they don't account for things like language differences, vocal modulations, expressions of a disability, or anything like that when they mark a noise or activity as threatening. Then if you look at the classrooms, and particularly special education classrooms, we've heard from many people about increased surveillance in general of student classrooms, but in some jurisdictions, there are certain additional types of cameras and sensors that are being added to special education classrooms in particular to further surveil those groups of students. Additionally, I'll point out over here the logo, this logo, the monitor, which represents device monitoring, and we can talk a little bit more about that as well. Device monitoring, as Clarence mentioned, is an example of how this type of surveillance transcends the on and off campus boundary, as well as the boundaries of any particular physical place on campus or within a classroom. A school-issued device like a laptop or tablet goes everywhere with the student, goes home with the student to do their homework, take their tests, and there may be apps that students download on their personal phones as well, like for hall passes or at the bus, or checking into school or sports with digital IDs, whatever. So most of the school-issued devices contain these all-in-one tools and software systems that can monitor all of the above things, but including things like message screening and emails. So this has caused really, really immediate and constant harm to kids, especially a lot of LGBTQ students, some of whom have been outed to their parents or to other people like law enforcement based on keywords that were flagged. And it's not just that students use their devices to maybe look up resources or seek out community on sensitive topics or whatever, but it's even more direct and can be even more casual than that. Terms like gay or trans themselves are being flagged. And with message screening, this could be just something casual communication between friends. And there's also no way for us to know. Sometimes schools have the option to change the terms and what things are going to be flagged. And sometimes it's a private company that makes those. And we don't know how much is being edited, whether they're suggesting the terms, who's coming up with these terms. No one knows anything. I also want to use device monitoring as kind of a space to mention social media monitoring, which is the thing I hear the most about from the youth defenders we speak to, and we'll talk a bit more about later. But, we hear about how many of, firearms and drug cases that you all are seeing are coming up from police monitoring kids' social media, whether by fake Instagram accounts or whatever else. And I also want to note the kids' own uses of devices here. We've heard from so many people that when they get my kid's phone, that's that. Kids have videos and photos and stuff in their own messages all the time and stuff in their own social media that gets used against them. And then, of course, when incidents happen, every other kid pulls up their phone to film it, and they all have messages and more content about it later. So the amount of content at play is massive. You can see how surveillance on the school device, combined with surveilling social media and everything else, combined with what they have on their own devices already, basically leaves kids with no place that their digital activity is safe. Stepping back again for a moment to the physical surrounding community, if I zoom in here on the parking lot of Hell School, you can see how these types of things like ALPRs, stop sign cameras, the visitor management and facial recognition systems, weapons detectors, and generally cameras, these bleed into public roads and the larger community. This is really important to mention because a lot of times we hear things get dismissed, like let's say by judges or whoever, in deference to schools. And the specialty of schools. Schools are often held in this sort of special status, like they can do whatever because they're a school. But these systems are really just using that lower standard that often gets applied to schools to increase surveillance of the entire community as well, and kids in their off-campus lives. Same here with the bus loop and the school buses, as I already mentioned earlier. So many years ago, there was a surge of memes called the FBI agent in my phone, or the FBI agent in my computer, my webcam. It was even before COVID and even before things got this, pervasively bad in schools with surveillance. And students were making memes about the FBI agent surveilling them in their computer and making jokes about the agent like helping with their homework and being part of their life. There was this running joke already for many young people about this sort of omniscient, surveillant companion. And as we move into talking more specifically about the criminal legal system and youth defense, I wanted to mention this to bring up one of the big picture concerns that these issues bring up for us, which is really what is going to be the meaning of the Fourth Amendment for future generations. What is the reasonable expectation of privacy, for example, for an entire generation of people that has never expected privacy anywhere, like in a bathroom? So the long-term implications of normalizing these practices are also really concerning in that way. So with an understanding of the tech and kind of the world that it's creating for these kids, let's talk more specifically about the inflection points of the criminal legal system. Of course, it's pervasive in really every aspect of it, but it can be helpful to break it down into a couple different categories. And I'm going to talk about these three in particular, which is kind of the information sharing pathways, criminal adjacent proceedings, and data outliving the process. So information sharing. You all know much more than me about the day-to-day of youth cases and youth being charged as adults and transfer cases and so on in your jurisdictions. And so I would never pretend to be the one explaining that stuff to you. But what I want to talk about regarding youth cases and youth charged as adults is how the information is getting kids into the system for those cases. There are a few examples here in these headlines that are good ones, a couple of which that Clarence talked about. For example, the so-called weapons detection tools that are enhanced by AI have mistaken things like chips and clarinets for guns and very directly created alerts and direct law enforcement intervention against those kids. This clarinet example is a really particularly interesting. This was in a middle school. So it was actually a very small child in a band room that was ended up being responded to by law enforcement for holding a clarinet. And then there are some of these so those are more kind of direct ways that these technologies can sometimes bring in law enforcement, but then there are more often these hidden and sort of insidious information sharing systems, like the Pasco County example that Clarence told you all about, where nobody knew that all the student records and disciplinary records were just being shared directly to the sheriff's office for purposes of categorizing these kids and creating little, dossiers, little files on whoever they wanted to label a potential criminal. So coupled with the so-called risk assessment tools, which, previous iterations were the more data-driven policing tools, where now these tech companies are using private algorithms to analyze all the information and then flagging who is likely to commit a crime or become an at-risk youth. It's not difficult to see how horrific the impacts are on young people who are still developing in general, but particularly in becoming permanently known to law enforcement and targeted in this way with all this information being collected about them. And, for when certain types of firearm charges or drug charges or whatever, for kids over whatever age it is in your jurisdiction, which that'll get them automatically charged as an adult, then they're now living through the worst of both systems and that they're being monitored like children with absolutely no right to privacy and no room for error. But then they're now being charged as adults and carrying the consequences of that forever. There are several paths that the data about youth sort of follows. And it creates, I think, a good framework to follow where the tech is going to play into it and how the data might be shared. First, everything begins and ends with school resource officers. They have these incredibly blurred lines with local police, and I know that you all know this already, and sometimes they are local police that are just assigned to the schools, so it's always a very chummy back and forth in most cases where it's easy to just have the SRO do stuff in the school where they'll have a lower search standard, or the SRO can just have their buddy in the police department send them social media posts or other data that they collected with resources they have. And then with more technology integrating the school security systems and the greater, societal policing systems, this is basically going to be effortless information sharing between these entities that are already, well practiced in doing this. Second, the school administrators will often just share stuff with the police. There are many reasons for this, obviously. Sometimes there are things that they're required to report, but a lot of times school administrators are, they're overworked and they're under-resourced and they're not equipped to support vulnerable students or deal with situations that really a social worker or school psychologist should really be dealing with. So they just call the police. With these surveillance tools, this becomes even cheaper and involves less people and less effort because students can just get flagged for threatening or problematic behavior. And it might even create a direct alert to the police department, or the administrators might just trust the technology and involve law enforcement in the situation automatically based on what it says. And third, finally, law enforcement comes to schools as a workaround for information that they would otherwise need a warrant for. Common examples are them coming to school administrators for information on whether someone is a good kid or a bad kid, history of behavior, IDing students, school incident reports of things that led the kid to be arrested, and so on. With access to the school surveillance, this again becomes totally seamless, and the police don't even have to lift a finger really to get whatever they want about a young person's movements and their history and whatever else. And overlaying all these little relationships, of course, is the technology. So, and I'll also note that as a subtopic, there's an additional universe of concerns here as to the amount of access that the private companies have to these alerts and their role in creating them, as I mentioned earlier with the terms and the flagging terms, and how much of the disciplinary or criminal enforcement procedures they're also creating, playing into, and the effect that they're having there. The way that we have learned about how this is happening in places, and most offenders that we've spoken to have learned about them, essentially falls into a couple of different categories. First and foremost, the vibes. I mean, it's really common sense and anecdotes. We have heard from so many people in so many jurisdictions that sometimes figuring out the initial reporting parties for things that kids get picked up for is more than half the battle. And really, people realized that some information was coming from somewhere that could not be identified in any other way and deduced that it had to be from the school device, something like that. Second, of course, in discovery, which is self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised at some places where it's being openly mentioned that the officers essentially just tailed a student based on an anonymous tip from a school or got information in some other way and they just mention it. And we've talked to other defenders that have just noticed this stuff in discovery and really honed in on it and been able to find out that way. And third, of course, right to know, public records, requests, public contracts. Generally speaking, if you can find contracts in your jurisdiction that show which tech is being bought up, it can be really helpful to know what kinds of information is likely being created and used. Sometimes reporters can help with this, or you can try working with a law clinic to see if they have access to a tool like GovSpend, which can help you search for contracts like this. But ultimately, to find out who's sharing information with who, it's really kind of a combination of all of these things. And you have to understand the relationship in your area between the school enforcement program, whatever your SRO system is, and your local police department and how it functions along with. And so if you know that, and then you find out at least a little bit about what type of tech is being bought up in your area, then you know more about what to specifically ask for in discovery as well. And you can kind of follow the information that way. A good example of how this all bleeds together is one that we learned from our colleagues in Miami-Dade County. So Miami Beach is a heavily surveilled area. It's busy. There are tourists, residents. And it's an area of the country where a lot of new surveillance equipment is deployed and tested. They buy it up pretty early out there, and they have all the bells and whistles, basically. We learned that there's a high school right on the beach called Miami Beach Senior High. And Miami is a place where, I mean, Florida has mandatory school police departments following Parkland. And so Miami-Dade, school PD has their own police code. They're a fully functioning police department, and all the schools have them. And they have interagency messaging that, includes the local police and like the school police, vice versa. So, for example, if someone sent out like a citywide alert saying, does anyone know this person? It would also go to the school offices. So anyway, with something like social media monitoring, and of course, the school police usually know these kids and are aware of things happening in the school, then the police department will also know about planned group activities and groups of kids hanging out at the beach or walking in groups, things like that. So students who are at that school will be walking in a busy area and suddenly be accused of theft or doing something else because they're walking in a big group or whatever. But officers are also going to be aware of things like class dismissal times, senior ditch day. And so then the police will start going down to the beach and checking IDs and backpacks with no probable cause and find stuff, and then there you go. And so this is a real example that we learned of, which is where the arrest forms will say something like, this officer being informed that today is senior ditch day, so we saw a bunch of kids out and about and knew they were being truant. But that doesn't mean that they can search their backpacks, of course, but in those situations, they just do it, they just make up probable cause at that point and get around it. And so there's really just basically no room for not even error, but really freedom for these kids. And police show up because they've been informed by social media or from the real-time crime center. Another good example, so from the real-time crime center, kids walking in a tourist zone, someone who's surveilling the cameras from the real-time crime center can just signal out to a patrol officer in the streets and give a vague description like, oh, there's a kid who looks like XYZ, or there's a group of kids walking over here, etc. And now some random officer on the ground who would have never been able to have eyes on these kids for any reason in that situation is being going over there based on some vague description and making some type of reasonable suspicion or probable cause determination based on what they were told from the person who's actually surveilling them in the real-time crime center. We've also heard of things like law enforcement getting facial recognition hits from wherever else in the city, and then just going to schools and comparing it to yearbooks or school ID photos if they think that it's a minor, or asking the school admin to do it for them. Another example that we've heard the most about and happening all over is, of course, firearms charges and social media. Sheriff's offices make fake accounts all the time, pretending to be teenagers. They're patrolling on social media. They're using screenshots from, kids' stories or whatever as a basis for, probable cause for a search warrant. Now they're searching, like claiming that they saw them possessing a gun or drugs or whatever. And then often once this is set in motion, they'll use the same social media evidence to prove possession of a firearm, with sometimes the firearm not even actually being recovered. And detectives are now testifying as social media experts and things like this. But then, of course, once the school gets notified, something like gun possession is automatic expulsion in a lot of places. And then with these automatic alerts and social media, for some of these things like fighting or drugs, stuff that's, pretty typical among younger people, it's turning into arrests and felonies, which then automatically affects their standing in school or access to school before it's even been adjudicated. So, of course, the long-term consequences of this is that this type of tracking has, followed many children from youth cases to adult court, same detectives again and again, and can follow them, really for a really long time throughout their lives. And of course, another level of this is that there's a huge use of this type of social media surveillance to connect youth together and say that they're in a gang. And coupled with the other surveillance in their neighborhood and around their campus and on their devices, becomes really impossible sometimes to evade being put on a list like this for absolutely no reason. So criminal adjacent proceedings, once the school gets notified, or if the incident generates from the school, we enter this world where kids are expelled, go through basically hearings where they have to testify and have no representation, and where there's no standard of proof for the school admin or the school resource officer. School administration can even work off of anonymous tips or whatever they want. And often in these situations, the privacy rules for kids only apply somehow when it's convenient for the officers. We've heard from many colleagues that, there's no body-worn cameras for the SROs because of FERPA. And there's no, recording mechanism for what happens in the principal's office, but of course they can share whatever they want with police. So, this is exactly what's going on here when stuff off campus and on campus bleed together and turns into these, adjacent and really additional sort of like punishment proceedings. Something that we commonly hear from schools is that, or that we commonly hear from defenders, is that schools will have a kid fill out an incident form or something, totally un-Mirandized statements, and then they'll just give them directly to the police. People have tried to suppress these as the school admin acting as an agent of the police department, and found that the bench has been deferring to schools a lot in these situations. So it becomes this workaround and loophole for police to once again undercut, the child's rights. And as we were talking about just a minute ago with the firearms possessions, for example, that's one of the biggest ones we've seen as to how harshly these lead to these zero tolerance expulsions. They're doled out before the case has even been adjudicated, sometimes even before discovery. Just when the kid gets arrested on a certain level of a charge, they're already expelled. Sometimes the parents are sort of told, oh, this is going to be fine. We just need you to come in and talk about this, but it's not an expulsion. And it is an expulsion hearing, where they're forced to sign an agreement to a 365-day expulsion. And oftentimes this happens without enough time for counsel to get involved, not to mention these expulsion hearings have no, standard of evidence with permanent consequences. We've also heard that SROs, whether in testimony or being deposed or just anecdotally, will bring up prior suspension or bad behavior that didn't result in arrest. And then prosecutors hear all of this, even though it has nothing to do with the current case. Because if the child has been there, let's say since 8th, 9th grade, and now they're a senior, there's a really big negative impact when an SRO can already, has an eye on you and can now track everything that you do in such an effortless way. When the potential for so much of the disciplinary history to be essentially automated with no way to know how the kid was flagged, why they were flagged, no one logging the accuracy or whatever else over time, some of these kids are just going to have these disciplinary records that show a number of violations that could just be based on nothing. So data outliving the process, it kind of flows naturally from what we were just talking about. For example, kids being included in gang databases based on social media, who they know, where they hang out. There's no way to find out if they're on it. It follows them forever. Another really good example is something that we learned about from our colleagues in Philly. Their office noted patterns of cases where it was clear that juvenile probation department was working in concert with the Philadelphia PD to information share about kids who were on GPS monitoring. They noticed it in discovery, contacted the chief of probation, the chief of juvenile at the DA's office, and said, you need a warrant, you can't just information share about this. ultimately they ended up with cases where they were seeing the only evidence of their youth clients' participation in a crime was a result of this illegal GPS sharing. This ended up in them filing a motion that was a motion to suppress and a writ of prohibition, asking for the judge to say that this practice was illegal. And people, like basically the judge and nobody knew how to handle it. So this led to a city council hearing at which Track Group, the CEO of that company, which created the monitor, came to testify. And essentially in that hearing, nobody, probation, the tech company, anybody could really testify as to what was actually in the contracts. And things were really alarming things were found out. For example, when kids have records expunged, what did the private company retain? They just kept the GPS records indefinitely. They were just stored off site. And so all of this was really discovered through, them filing this motion in this city council hearing, but also their local reporter in the Philadelphia Inquirer looking into all this stuff. But GPS monitoring, which isn't new, this is a good example of how this type of data sharing relationship is created and how it can outlive forever. So you think about that in conjunction with these like new types of tools, and that really gives you a good sense. The main takeaways here: follow the data relationship and the information sharing pathway. Ask for technology use and discovery. In our materials, I've added in what we have is our omnibus tech discovery checklist, which is sort of an all-encompassing ask, list for different types of tech that you could see in your cases. Challenge the statements that are made in school. Definitely the consent, consent like searches for devices, students voluntarily giving these statements, which we all know is never really voluntary. You can challenge the tech itself, the reliability of it. You can challenge how the tech was used, whether they extracted too much detail from too much information from your client's cell phone, things like that. The criminal adjacent proceedings, sometimes it's impossible. I know that it happens immediately, but if possible, get involved in your client's criminal adjacent proceeding at school when you get involved in their case. And then, of course, focus on public records requests, right to know. A good place to look is also city council meetings and budgets to find out what's being brought up in your area. And then I can just zoom through these really quick so you guys can just read them. But we have, published like a set of recommendations that we think should, apply to law enforcement use of this technology, and certainly to youth serving institutions buying it up. And these include, no automation, that there should be a warrant required, that youth digital data shouldn't be searched based on consent, that they should have the right to counsel in criminal adjacent proceedings. And of course that they should have the right to notice and the right to challenge their inclusion on any lists that they're going to be put on based on an automated alert or any of these technologies. Thank you all so much. And I'll just go ahead and quickly say that, this is what we love to do, and this is what we do every day. So we are here to help you. If you see anything pop up in your cases, and please reach out to us. We'd love to be there for you. Thank you.
Whew. My head is spinning. I have so many thoughts and feelings, as I'm sure many of you all do as well. I want to thank Clarence and Shreya for their incredibly educational and terrifying presentations, and for all the amazing work they are doing to fight back against this brave new world, and the amazing work they're doing to help equip us to fight back as well. I also want to thank the Gault Center staff for their partnership, for all the work that they've done to bring this, to bring us together today, and to put this webinar together. I want to quickly provide, just because my head is still processing, a very quick reflection, and then I want to draw our experts. I want to draw Clarence and Shreya back in to answer some of the questions that folks have posed in the chat, as well as potentially some others if we have time. Quickly though, Marianne started us off by reminding us about the power of questions. And whenever I come across something new in our work, there are two questions I like to ask. The first is, what is this like that I know? And the second is, how is it different? And the first question, what is this like that I know, reminds me to get back to basics and foundational principles about our work. It helps me transfer existing knowledge and existing experience to a new area. And then, how is it different? Asking the question, how is it different, helps me think through what is unique about this new situation, and pushes me to adapt and tailor existing knowledge to the new situation or area of law. And so, as the conversations were unfolding and as Clarence and Shreya were sharing with us all their knowledge, I couldn't help but think about the fact that we've been here before. We've been in this place where there are these new kind of groundbreaking investigatory technologies that have been sold as revolutionary and unassailable, right? Things like fingerprint, hair analysis, DNA, dog tracking, stingray track. I mean, you could just go on and on and on about the way that law enforcement tries to get creative and tries to pitch things as unchallengeable or foolproof evidence that someone is guilty. And the reality is that all of these things have been challenged effectively and successfully, both with respect to the technology itself and with respect to the way that's applied in a particular case. And so going back to basics, it made me think about a variety of avenues to consider in terms of challenging AI surveillance and AI-aided investigations. A couple of buckets to just ponder and think about, right? One is thinking about going back to evidence law, right? Evidence 101, and thinking about how we keep things out, how we make things inadmissible or challenge their admissibility. Think about Daubert and Fry and Motorola. Think about chain of custody. Think about hearsay objections. Really go back to basics and think about how this evidence is not, AI surveillance and kind of the technology associated with it really doesn't get special exemptions from the rule of evidence. And we need to hold the government to that standard. Second is the bucket of discovery investigation, right? Think about just straight up asking, how was AI used in this case? Create a new section in your standard discovery request template, requesting disclosures with respect to AI. I also think about Dr. Kavanaugh and the advice that she gives when dealing with experts, right? Is ask for all of the proprietary and trade secret information that people like to hide or say they can't disclose, right? Ask for the manuals, ask for the notes, ask for how it works, ask for all the technology disclosures, ask for all the proprietary information and constitutionalize it. Make it about a Sixth Amendment right to confront, so that the court tries to force them to order it. When the Stingray technology first came out, we pushed for them to disclose how the technology worked. And rather than reveal that information, they just started dismissing cases. So force them into tough decisions. And then the last bucket I'll just kind of throw out there, and I'm sure there's a lot more and a lot deeper that we could get into, but to really come back to also effective theory of the case. As Clarence was talking about these vape detectors, how many kids were in the bathroom? Is this a case of innocent presence? Right? Think about technology being an unreliable witness and really going into the amount of false positives that it reports. And then think about lack of corroboration, insufficient evidence, and the fact that the government has to rely exclusively on this technology and can't provide any additional corroboration. And so just some quick reflections about the importance of going back to basics and thinking about this through the lens of what we already know, the work that we already do, and applying how we challenge and keep out existing expert testimony or existing investigatory tools used by the government out of evidence in our cases. Now, that's how it's similar to what we've done. How is it different, right? This is where I want to really draw Clarence and Shreya back in and get to some of the questions in the chat and talk about how the tools that they're seeing and they've talked about today are being deployed in jurisdictions, how we can find out about it, how we can really challenge it. And so one of the first questions really is about issue spotting. In the chat, Alex asks, is there a way to determine if school districts in our respective practice areas are using this technology? And I want to broaden that a little bit for both of you and broaden it to really kind of law enforcement generally or school districts. How do we know whether they're using AI technology to surveil and or investigate our clients?
I can kick us off. So Two things. First, I would say like the default presumption today should be that there is at least some form of AI surveillance happening in your school district and by law enforcement agencies. And so it's a matter of figuring out which ones they're using. As we described in both of the presentations, some of the most common are the student device monitoring technology. So if you hear about companies like I can never get those two right, Go Guardian and Gaggle, as well as many others, Bark and Securely and others, that's a good place to start. Really paying attention to local like school district and police procurement practices. So like those school district meetings where they're just like passing these contracts through consent items, like that's where we need to be paying very close attention and being and raising those questions during those decision points. I would also say there are some like civil society resources that have begun like aggregating like certain uses of police surveillance technology. So there are organizations like coalitions like DFLOC, for example, that are kind of tracking the use of flock cameras and ALPRs around the country. Electronic Frontier Foundation has a like tool where they are tracking a variety of surveillance technologies and their use by law enforcement around the country. So those are also good places to start. But I also want to really highlight and uplift what Shreya said in her presentation around, discovery and some of those other like opportunities that exist within the scope of a case to be able to surface the technologies and then making sure that you're sharing that with folks in your office and in your field, because oftentimes there'll be one or two folks that know, oh yeah, we do have that drone surveillance program within our school district. And it only sits with those one or two defenders. So making sure that we're spreading the word. But I don't know, Shreya, if you have others that you're thinking of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree with everything Clarence said, and I think one of the biggest things to Eduardo's point, like broadly to think about in your case, is one thing that we always think, like ask people is ask yourself, how did you get from A to B in your case? How did your client become involved in the first place? That's often like the root question you need to ask to find out that some technology was used. I totally agree with Clarence that you should assume that there is something being used. The only question in your jurisdiction is which one and how much and how was it used in your case. So ask yourself those kind of, as Eduardo really said, the questions you already know how to ask in your case, figure out, where are those gaps? Like, how did they pick your kid? How did they get to your client? Those are really the things that, help me when I'm thinking through this.
Yeah, Trey, I love that you called out vibes, right? Like, follow your instincts. If something just feels off, like exactly what Shreya said, right? I don't understand how they got from point A to point B in this case. You should be asking yourself what role technology may have played in that, or what they're not quite disclosing. Could be technology, right? It could be some anonymous informant or confidential informant. It could be a confidential informant or technology that they're referring to as a confidential informant, right? But really sit in that discomfort and ask those questions and pull that string until you get your answer. I also want to highlight, as you all were talking, the idea of FOIAing information, the contracts that law enforcement or that the schools have with technology companies. Or in some places, your jurisdiction may have an office of contracts and procurement, either within the specific agency itself or for the whole jurisdiction. And oftentimes they have a database that contains, if not the terms of the contracts, at least the existence of the contract. And that may be a good project to have a summer intern really dig into, in order to have your office start collecting and start really digging into this information in a very intentional way. Thank you both for that. I want to touch upon one of the questions related to disability, but I also want to bring in the race angle. Clarence, you talked about the fact that AI was really going to further the creation of a digital underclass. And I want to hear from both of you on this. What data or evidence should we be collecting, and how do we collect it to really dig into and demonstrate these disparities? The way that AI is going to be disproportionately surveilling, or already is disproportionately surveilling, Black and Latina kids, how it's disproportionately impacting them. And then, same for young people with disabilities. How is it really going to impact them in disproportionate ways?
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little tricky because there's so many layers to it, and it can be hardest to get to those deeper levels. So, there's some like anecdotal information that's going to be available to you about like some of the discriminatory practices. So, for example, like if you're seeing, wait a minute, there's a pattern of like these are the kids who are being labeled by the system as X, Y, and Z. That's a very good way of like being able to point to it. Oftentimes, though, from legal perspective, and I'm a civil rights attorney by training, so when we're thinking about intentional discrimination claims or disparate impact claims, those like evidentiary standards get heightened, and a lot of times it requires getting underneath the hood of some of these AI systems to understand like what is the model architecture, what were the training data sets that were being used, what are the outputs of the models, so on and so forth. And that can get very challenging, time intensive, cost intensive as well. And so in those instances, I think it can be very helpful to like reach out to folks like the organizations on this webinar, and we can kind of help with figuring out like how can you get underneath the hood of your particular model. But we already see some data, like as I shared during my presentation, we have data, for example, from the Center on Democracy and Technology, where we see disproportionate use of AI surveillance technologies at schools that serve Black and Brown young people, so Title I schools. We have some evidence there. NCES, the National Center on Education Statistics, is a federal government agency that does some data collection, and we've also seen that same kind of correlation there in terms of schools that have like more likely to have school cameras or anonymous threat reporting systems tend to be over-indexed in our communities. So there's some evidence, but just to be very clear and transparent, there's really no federal data collection at all around AI surveillance technologies and particularly their demographic like impacts. And obviously, with this administration, we're not going to get that data for a while. A lot of it is going to take some good old fashioned like sweat equity of like really looking at the patterns that you're seeing in your communities, doing the investigations, reaching out to experts that can help you like scrutinize the technology that you have in question to understand what to unearth what those disparate demographic effects look like. Just a quick little anecdote on this. When I was, I think Shreya had mentioned the Pasco County case. When we were working on the Pasco campaign, it took us years to be able to actually figure out what those demographic consequences were. It took rounds and rounds of FOIA requests. We had to figure out like the different systems and how they were interacting and who was collecting demographic data, who wasn't collecting demographic data. So I just want to say that the level of effort that it takes can be substantial, but it is really important because in that case, for example, we found that it was like 90% of Black students were eligible for that predictive policing program. They had the highest rates of any other group that we saw.
Shreya, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I only have two small things to add. Again, totally agree with everything Clarence said. The one thing that I would say is that you can also look at data that's been collected as to how this stuff has been used in adults. Like, there's so much, for example, facial recognition. There is a massive swath of data out there about how discriminatory it is and how bad it is at recognizing BIPOC people. And there have been a number of widely publicized and litigated wrongful arrests there. So sometimes if the study or the data for what you're specifically looking at isn't available or hasn't been done, you should take that information and then take what you know about kids and just make the argument yourself. If it's discriminatory towards adults, how could it not be discriminatory towards kids who have changing faces, who are growing? It's very clear. And so I think if you also look at that, and then the second thing I was thinking is just look at sort of tech accuracy stuff, like for example, NIST, National Institute of Centers in Technology, which sometimes evaluates algorithms and stuff like this. I'm again thinking of facial recognition because they specifically look at these, but there are other entities like this that will sometimes look at how tech like this works. Like, for example, Clarence was talking about the weapons detection, gunshot detection. A number of people have studied this, engineer scientists, and are like, this does not work. Like, this is not real. And so you can look at data like that and combine it with the data that you already know to kind of make the best of it, I think.
Great. And I will be full disclosure, I'm still educating myself on AI and all of that. But one of the big kind of takeaways for me has been this idea of garbage in, garbage out, right? That if it gets trained on garbage, it's going to kick out garbage. And we see a lot of these false positives. And just generally, the vibes that I get is that AI reflects in many ways a lot of our own biases as a society, whether it's about race, whether it's about disability, and worsens them, perpetuates them. And so I think our default should be not just assuming that AI is being used, but that assuming that biased AI is being used, and that we should really be trying to get under the hood and challenge it. And with that, I will kick it to Marianne.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, Clarence. We are just at the beginning of our understanding of this tech and this information. And the information that you all provided today was incredibly helpful to us as a community. I'll use Clarence's term. It's going to take some sweat equity for us to get underneath the understanding of all of this new information. We are going to make the slides available after the program. We're going to collect the resources and information that Shreya and Clarence have mentioned, and we're going to get that all back out to you. We're also going to ask you to please continue to fill out that survey that we sent out prior to the webinar to let us know what you're seeing in your communities. And just as a final reminder, our power is in asking questions. None of us fully understand what's going to happen with the future of AI and surveillance, but we know it's already infringing on the freedoms of young people, and most especially the freedoms of young people living in Black and Latino and other communities who are already being surveilled too frequently by other systems. So, defender community and advocates, thank you for being with us. And thank you so, so much to Clarence, Shreya, Eduardo for helping us to begin this journey of pushing back and transforming how AI surveillance impacts young people across the nation. Thank you.